Our next presenter here is Steve Turner. He is the Director of Security Architecture from Prudential, and he is going to cover one of my favorite topics, which is we've always done it that way, basically, right, Steve? So you're going to kind of cover like why you shouldn't do that. Matt talked about that a little bit in the keynote, so I'm really excited for this one because that drives me absolutely insane when people say, well, this is how we've always done it, and it just drives me absolutely nuts. So Steve, go ahead and take it away.
Awesome. Thank you, Mark. So hello, everyone. So this is my first talk that I've done at a SANS summit. I haven't seen anybody really go into some of the stuff that I'm prepared to present on today. Basically, you know, the summary of what I'm talking about today is, you know, going to the cloud, you know, you should probably not just adopt what you've always known and don't use the things that you've typically had in the past. You kind of need to do a little bit more than that. So first, you know, who am I? So Steve Turner, I'm the Director of Security Architecture at Prudential. I'm fairly active on Twitter, and, you know, my LinkedIn's on there. I've been doing IT infrastructure for around 6 years and specifically InfoSec for about 6 years. I apologize in advance. My hair is a different color than what's in my picture, but because of the current situation, you know, I've kind of had to deal with what I have available. So jumping in. So what I've learned from, you know, my time, you know, in IT infrastructure and just security in general is, you know, don't treat the cloud like you've treated your on-prem systems. You know, you can't just go and backhaul everything back to your existing infrastructure. Don't try to fit, you know, the cloud into those existing paradigms that you're used to, you know, whether that's, you know, forcing it back to, you know, again, on-prem infrastructure, on-prem security controls, trying to fit it into your existing processes. You know, I believe that, you know, Matt and John highlighted some of these other things earlier, but, you know, don't go and create multiple identity repositories. It's just going to be a headache that, you know, you're going to end up having to unwind later. Don't try and take your existing security controls and just throw them up in the cloud in the same way that you've been doing it. And then, you know, the biggest thing that I've seen a lot of people make a huge mistake on is they just turn logging on across everything, and they let all those logs be dumped into their SIEM, and they end up paying, you know, exorbitant amounts of money to store these logs that they don't even know what they're bringing back. So, you know, the summary of all of that is, you know, if you do any of these things that I have listed here, you're just going to spend significant time and in some larger, you know, organizations, years unwinding all of that technical debt that you've created. So with that being said, what should you actually be doing? You know, just to echo, you know, what was said during the keynote today, you know, invest in a centralized identity strategy, you know, provisioning, deprovisioning, authentication, you know, choose a single source of record that you're going to work with, because at the end of the day, you don't want all of these, you know, different organizations refer to them in different ways, but cloud accounts, unfederated accounts, you know, multiple types of other accounts out there that are unmanaged that will just end up being either a security headache later or, you know, potentially an insider risk later because, you know, an employee got terminated or, you know, they kept that in their back pocket to do something with later. Look at your cloud providers. Look at what native controls you can utilize within those cloud providers. Look at where you can, again, you know, echoing what was said earlier today, centralize your security visibility and controls where possible. Reevaluate your log and monitoring strategies. You know, again, don't just dump logs to dump logs. You know, take a measured approach. See what kind of logs are available to you. What, you know, I'm going to talk about a little bit later in the presentation is a lot of these logs aren't turned on by default. Things are getting better, but you need to make sure that you turn on the right logging and pull back the right logs and actually do the right analysis so that you're getting benefit from it. This point I can't, like emphasize enough, but reevaluate your network needs and implement solutions that don't require you to backhaul stuff through your VPN. I know it's easy to do. I know that it's something super simple for most people to just say, we're gonna bring all the traffic back. But what value are you getting from doing that? Instead of kind of taking a step back like you should be with a lot of these cloud solutions out there, does it make sense to backhaul all of that traffic? Are you again just creating more of a problem later, especially like we've seen during the pandemic and lots of organizations struggling to keep up with either things like video chatting or just normal collaboration? Everybody is backhauling this traffic and it's creating huge headaches. Look at some of the more modern solutions out there for helping do this, whether it's something residing natively within each of your different cloud providers, or something like a secure web gateway or a cloud proxy. Automation and orchestration are your friends. Like we heard, as it relates to even static code analysis, if you can automate or orchestrate different processes as it relates to the cloud, to identify security misconfigurations before they happen, you're going to save yourself a lot of time and frustration later. And then the biggest thing that I think that most people skip out on, or they try to back into after they've already moved, is you need to shift your processes and people to leverage either existing folks that you have or hire people who have the knowledge. Because if you go into the cloud, again, if you don't have that knowledge base internally and you don't have the right resources or the right skills, you're going to be backing into that later, and it's going to again just create frustration within your different businesses in the places that you work at, or it's just going to create headaches and frustration for you as a security team to be able to keep up with what's going on. So starting at a super high level, like again, this is a huge topic, so I'm not going to be able to cover it all, but if I had to give some super high level recommendations across the board for the different cloud providers, I would review whatever security roadmaps or white papers are out there for the different cloud providers. You wouldn't believe how much untapped knowledge is out there for specific recommendations that a lot of the cloud providers, especially the big players, have that's available out there. You can utilize a lot of the traditional security recommendation sources such as NIST or CIS benchmarks or anything else that along those lines. A lot of cloud providers are incorporating that natively into their solutions so that you can get automated recommendations for what you're not doing or could be doing within each of your cloud providers. Again, can't emphasize this enough, but setting up SSO or federated identities for all of your cloud services and making sure that you have a single identity and authentication plane is so incredibly important. It allows you to basically bring back all and control all those authentications. Like was mentioned earlier, you can do risk-based authentications or some sort of conditional access where, if somebody is authenticating or some sort of authentication is happening that doesn't meet your existing criteria or meet the things that you're comfortable with, you can make sure that authentication doesn't happen because it is being analyzed and you have, those tools backing you. Again, deprovisioning, so incredibly important. Avoids, that insider risk scenario or, those outside threat actors from getting into your environments with identities that you didn't know about. And then securing root and administrative credentials. Now, you're going to run into situations where you have to have either unfederated accounts for like a break glass scenario, or you're going to have unfederated accounts for other reasons because they don't work through the federated scenarios. For those accounts, you want to make sure that you apply additional monitoring and additional controls. Enable MFA. That should be like the bare minimum that you're doing across the board here. And then the biggest thing that people don't go and do is they don't enable alerting when those unfederated accounts are used. So they may be used without your knowledge. You're not able to baseline what's going on with those accounts unless you have some sort of monitoring in place. And then, you know, just to re-emphasize this, ingest and alert off of relevant logs into your SIEM. You know, like was mentioned earlier by John, you know, we're talking about something like Office 365. They have an entire document about what each event means, you know, in the unified audit log that they have and what you should be watching out for. There's a lot of guidance out there. Today, I'm going to talk about a lot of the bigger cloud players and what you can do. So again, that centralized security story, to just push that forward within your organization, connect all of your cloud services to a centralized source. A very easy way for most organizations to realize this is to set up a CASB as well as a secure web gateway. That gives you centralized visibility and controls of authentication or access to your cloud resources. And it fits in with this like modern new world of, you know, a lot of people coin the term future of work, or, you know, the anything around that. These types of things will let you easily apply policy, whether it's monitoring, governance, or any of these other types of detections across all of your cloud providers, whether they be SaaS, infrastructure as a service, PaaS, basically all of that. And it'll enable so much more very easily and without you having to relearn, you know, how to make a wheel or something along those lines. So, you know, the biggest thing that I recommend there is if you don't have one, I'd recommend looking into it. If it's not the end of the world if you can't go and deploy this in your organization, but it does make it a hell of a lot easier for you to alert and also take action if there's something bad going on in your environment. Enabling data encryption. Now, this subject, you know, I don't see it get as much attention as I'd expect it to. Most cloud providers have the ability for you to natively encrypt what's going on, rather than just trusting them and saying, you know, big cloud provider says that their storage is encrypted, but, you know, what if you want to secure that data with your own keys, or just, you know, let's say that you don't want to secure with your own keys, but you want to add another layer of encryption. Most cloud providers support that. You know, Office 365, Salesforce, Workday, a lot of them support native encryption. If they don't support native encryption, one of the other benefits of something like a CASB is being able to encrypt that data utilizing the CASB with your own keys. So that's something that I highly recommend across the board. And then setting password policies, even if you're federated. Make sure that you set up a password policy in all of your cloud providers for those unfederated accounts. Some cloud providers allow you to have some level of integration with your federated identities as it relates to these password policies, but I recommend setting them up so that you can mirror your password policies on-prem or make them more stringent if we're talking about some of those administrative or root credentials. I see this as a big miss for a lot of people, that they don't realize that, oh, that's something that I actually have to set up, or I'm not enforcing something similar. It's so incredibly important. So with that said, you know, I want to pivot into the native controls and talk about that for a second. So a lot of the big cloud providers, and today, you know, I'm only going to be talking about a few of them, have built-in native controls or security recommendations or central hubs for a lot of the alerting, governance, and other security telemetry within their ecosystems. They also give you an easy way to alert off of them out of your SIEM, which is so incredibly important instead of you having to do all of that custom built correlation yourself. So, you know, the biggest thing is, like, I see that a lot of these cloud providers are continuing to get better. Unfortunately, some of them are still premium plays, But I think what we've seen, especially during the pandemic and enabling remote work more and more, is that a lot of the bigger players are moving a lot of that licensing or a lot of those security tools that used to be a pay-to-play option. They're moving it to become a native option because they see the benefit that it just creates less headache for their customers. So if those native controls, again, are not available, you do have other options. The biggest thing, and again, is something like a cloud access security broker or a secure web gateway, where you're able to put those controls in front of your cloud service providers. And they're, again, super easy to implement. You don't have to be a rocket scientist to set a lot of them up. And you can pull back the alerts and the logs back to whatever your centralized platform is for alerting and monitoring. So I'm not going to read through everything on this slide. Again, a lot of these next slides you're going to see are extremely wordy because I want you to be able to take this information back and action it. So for AWS, you have to make sure that you go across the board and turn on the security functionality, whether that's things like CloudTrail, things like the IAM Access Analyzer, Detective, Guard Duty, Inspector, Macy, all of that needs to be turned on. You're losing out on a lot of visibility and a lot of control if you don't have those turned on within your AWS environment. Thankfully, again, as the security story gets furthered within all of these different cloud providers, AWS is centralizing a lot of these security alerting and monitoring and governance into a centralized place called Security Hub. Security Hub gives you all of these valuable automatic recommendations within your AWS environment. I know that we heard earlier today people talking about OpenS3 buckets and things like that. AWS is doing that for you automatically today. You just have to turn on the features and make sure that somebody is monitoring what kind of recommendations are coming out of it. Action those recommendations. The thing that's awesome about AWS that a lot of other cloud providers haven't built in yet is they actually let you trigger a test alert for each one of the things that that they're recommending or the controls that they have within their platform, so that you can see what that alert looks like when a certain particular thing gets triggered within their environment. I'd love to see other security players go and do that, but it's extremely valuable and it gives you an easier way to set up alerts within your SIEM or within Security Hub to know exactly what you're looking for when those alerts come through. I've dropped some links to some additional resources about how to set up a lot of this. Amazon has an awesome white paper about all of the recommendations that they recommend holistically to around securing your various AWS microservices, VPCs, or other services that you're leveraging. I highly recommend that you at least skim it or read it if you have an opportunity. So Azure. I'd argue that Azure was probably the first one in the space to have this centralized security view or this centralized security hub. What I've found that is a lot of people don't even turn on, a lot of the security features that sit within the Azure space. Azure Security Center. Upgrade all your Azure subscriptions to at least the standard licensing. It gives you an insane amount of recommendations. It deals with things like misconfigured firewalls, open storage buckets, misconfigured permissions to different database resources. It now does vulnerability assessments automatically. It's just such an insane resource that a lot of people aren't taking advantage of, and gives you a very easy roadmap on how to get to a better place within Azure. We were again talking earlier today about the idea of just-in-time administrative access. Microsoft's built a solution that you can leverage within Azure as well as Office 365 called PIM, or Privileged Identity Management. That allows you to basically take away all standing admin access within Azure or Office 365 and only elevate access when you need it, and time box that access, as well as require other conditions in order to request that access. It's an incredibly powerful tool. A lot of folks don't leverage this, and it really isn't much impact to your operational processes in terms of making your admins do it. We've had a lot of success with utilizing that with not a whole lot of noise from our administrative folks. So the last thing again is just centralizing your logs, bringing back the right logs. In Azure and AWS, there's very specific ways to do that. I've linked to some information for you to be able to leverage that. So Office 365, or now it's rebranded as Microsoft 365. Turn on the audit logging. It's not turned on by default. A lot of these things are getting better, and Microsoft is starting to turn on a lot of these defaults, turning on a lot of these security features by default. You need to turn it on. It within the tool itself, like within the Microsoft 365 platform, you can look up to 90 days worth of logs. But again, like John was mentioning earlier, bring it back into your SIM. You can do initial analysis and correlation and monitoring off of that. A tool that I didn't mention here, but kind of pivoting into the native security features within Office 365. If you have the ATP suite in Office 365, there's an awesome tool called Orca that allows you to basically do a holistic analysis of what your security posture looks like from an ATP perspective, which is their advanced threat protection around email, links, and other collaboration tools within their platform. And it also allows you to do analysis of your email security and gives you real recommendations that you can go and action and take. Orca is completely free. You can run it against your environment with minimal impact. You don't even have to run it with administrative credentials. Super highly recommended. Gives you quick actionable items to deal with things like, phishing, malware, and spam. So, with that being said, I would make sure that you look into the settings for all of those various features within Office 365 paired with that tool to make sure that they're adjusted so that you don't find yourself in a bad spot later. This again was something that was mentioned earlier today, and I don't think gets a lot of visibility. Turn off Azure AD user consent for applications. You're opening yourself up, unless you have a different plan within your organization, for just general badness of your users being able to let other applications utilize the data that you have in Azure AD as well as Office 365. Now, that being said, Microsoft has been introducing some preview features that allow you to build out a holistic process to allow your users to request applications to integrate with Office 365 and Azure AD. I would continue to keep a lookout for that. But a lot of the attacks and a lot of the core recommendations from Microsoft around this is that they had been seeing several attacks utilizing this avenue, and it's just something very easy for you to turn off if you're not using it within your organization or you don't have visibility into it. Turning on conditional access and MFA. Again, it's super key. If you don't have these two features turned on, there's no reason why you shouldn't be looking at them, whether it's in Azure AD or it's in whatever identity platform that you're integrating with Office 365. The biggest thing that I want to highlight here is by turning this on, make sure that you have accounts when you're testing this, like for your global admins that are excluded from this, because you don't want to lock them out and end up having to call Microsoft to get yourself unlocked or access back to your tenant. I know that this is one of Mark's favorite topics, and I know a lot of people have engaged him on this. Turn on identity protection and password hash sync. You're going to get a lot of blowback in your organization for people who don't fully understand this. By turning on these two features, as it relates to Office 365, you'll be able to look at things like smart lockouts, IP lockouts, and discovering if you have leaked credentials. Things that you see on Have I Been Pwned or any of the big like data leaks that have been on that that have been announced or talked about in the news, like Microsoft is pulling in all of that intelligence, and they're alerting if you have people in your organization utilizing those passwords. This also gives you a great, path forward if you decide that you want to go away from some of the traditional identity providers and have Microsoft be your front door to Office 365 rather than, your traditional identity providers. So cloud app security. Cloud app security is Microsoft's CASB. They have a wealth of anomalous detection and threat protection built into the CASB. By turning this on, you will save yourself, again, a ton of headaches without having to do any custom correlations. Cloud app security will save it will save you later, like from being able to know what's going on in your Office 365 environment. You can also hook up other cloud providers to their CASB and leverage those same detections and baselines across all of your cloud providers to know what type of activity is going on. So with everything that I kind of talked about above, the one caveat and the thing that I just really want to call out is a lot of features that I'm talking about here are still behind a paywall. Slowly, a lot of these features are moving out from behind the paywall into some of the more traditional subscriptions that people utilize around Microsoft 365. But a lot of the really bigger security features, such as advanced threat protection and some of the correlations that they can do in their environment with their endpoint tooling and some other security tools, is all in the premium licensing. I dropped a link in here where I know that their licensing is extremely confusing. One of the Microsoft employees actually put together a super awesome PDF on understanding where you land on the licensing scale as it relates to Office 365. Totally recommend it if you're confused about what's available to you and what's not. So again, going back to those security recommendations that cloud providers have started to bake in, they have something called Secure Score. So if you're super confused about where to even start, there's two things that I'd recommend in their world. There's Secure Score, which is a whole different, portal within Microsoft 365 that gives you security recommendations that you can action quickly. It'll tell you the impact about turning on those various security features, and it'll rate it for you about what type of, by turning on that security feature, what have you protected yourself against? Highly recommend it. It changes all the time based on what new features or new attacks are out in the wild. But then the other resource that I recommend is they have a security roadmap, like if you're deploying a new or you have an existing Microsoft 365 environment. It gives you things that you should do within 30 days, 60 days, and 90 days. I highly recommend that everybody take a look at it. We're seeing more and more cloud providers out there provide this type of guidance. So turning our eyes to Salesforce. Again, you're going to see a lot of consistent recommendations here. Turn on the appropriate auditing and monitoring for anomalous behaviors. This is built into Salesforce natively without having to pay for it. You can obviously leverage a CASB again where possible, but that's built into Salesforce, and they have something very similar to what Microsoft has with 365, where they'll actually even give you security recommendations and alert you or show you what those alerts look like to be able to alert off of either in your SIM or your Salesforce administrator can take a look at it. There's tools that Salesforce has built to do a analysis very similar to the Orca tool that Microsoft provides. They have a tool called Org Monitor that you can run across against your Salesforce environment to tell where you are from a security standpoint. It'll let you know how far out of baseline you are in terms of what Salesforce recommends and what your features are configured to and what they should be configured to. I can't emphasize enough that people should run this on a regular basis. This is something that can, again, make sure that you get back in line because maybe you rushed into a Salesforce implementation or you're just trying to, close some gaps or identify gaps that you have. I have some additional recommendations here as well. They have this insanely detailed white paper on what you should or shouldn't be doing within Salesforce and what features are being depreciated if you're leveraging them for security today within your environment. They have an additional security play that's a pay-to-play around Salesforce Shield. Again, if you're looking into CASBs, I'd recommend comparing and contrasting the features that are available there, because you may be able to leverage a CASB instead of utilizing Salesforce Shield. But if you're not looking to purchase a CASB, or Salesforce is kind of the backbone of your org, and you're not looking to buy something extremely expensive to address this, Salesforce Shield is a pretty good starting point. But again, I've linked to their insanely detailed security guide about where you should stand in terms of Salesforce. Highly recommend that people skim it. It's huge. It's a couple hundred pages. So Workday I've found is a little bit trickier than most of your other cloud providers out there. I highly recommend getting involved with your deployment of Workday within your organization, or if it's already deployed, talking to your HR organization or whoever manages your Workday instance. Understand how they've designed the security within their environment. This is where I am going to recommend a CASB first rather than building your own integration here, because you're going to realize a lot quicker time to get monitoring or detecting bad activity in Workday through a CASB rather than setting up your own custom integration. The CASB, or pretty much any CASB that I've seen so far that's integrated with Workday, is going to pull back all administrative and user activity, including commands that your administrators are running against your Workday backend. We've seen similar things with things like Salesforce and Office 365. This obviously, the caveat here is this doesn't apply to every cloud provider, but specifically with Workday, it's been very eye-opening about the amount of activity that you can see, as well as create alerts and governance to either suspend administrative accounts or suspend, people who are doing bad within your Workday environment. And then what's awesome is, because we're talking about HR systems here, it's super useful to baseline, what you're seeing folks do within the HR system against other activity across the environment, especially with people with tons of elevated access across environments. It'll allow you to compare and correlate against those other cloud applications within your environment, as well as some of, your endpoint activity that you're seeing if you're pulling those logs back. So with that being said, kind of pivoting over to the MITRE attack matrix for the cloud. So I think that this, and this may be a difference of opinion from what a lot of people see, I think it's a great starting point to understand where your org is from a high level. It hasn't been updated since it was introduced in October of 2019. So your mileage is going to vary depending on your org's cloud security maturity. Highly recommend that you go there and you see the different attack tactics that they've mapped out there for the cloud. It's, again, a great starting point to help figure out where are areas that you should start focusing within your organization. So with that being said, that was my presentation. Hopefully you guys got something out of it.
Well, fantastic, Steve. We do have a couple of questions that have come in online. The first one is from Vikram. Native controls are good, but in a multi-cloud environment, how do you create an equal pane? I think this means equal pane of glass or plane across different cloud service provider controls. And then do you consider third-party tools to normalize certain controls across cloud providers?
Yeah, so that's actually a really good question. So we've run into a lot of challenges around that in terms of being able to normalize those detections across cloud providers. I think where you're going to see the most value, again, is building those correlations either in your SIM or utilizing something that's going to centralize your visibility into your different instances that you have with the multiple cloud providers out there, such as a CASB. But if you've got multiple tenants, of that same cloud provider kind of across, different geographic locations, you're definitely going to run into a lot of problems, because I think this is a space that a lot of cloud providers are not mature in, to be able to put that governance laid across all of your different instances across the globe. Folks like AWS are getting better with this. I'm seeing Microsoft start to go in that direction as well with Azure and Office 365, but I still think that story has a lot more to be played out to make it useful.
And then another question, and this one from Chris Ferris. What CASBs have you found work well with Workday? Can you detect elevated users and also VIPs versus, generic employees?
Sure. So so far in the testing that I've done at a bunch of different companies that I've been at, I found that Microsoft's poured a lot of resources into building their integration with Workday with Microsoft Cloud App Security. Netscope is definitely one of the top players out there that has poured an insane amount of resources into detecting the type of things that you're mentioning. And then McAfee, with their acquisition, we're seeing them really, really lay into that and pour additional resources into their CASB. And they can natively detect that as well. So those are the three that I definitely call out, just because I've either POC'd them or I've used them in a production scenario to detect that type of thing.
There's another part to Chris's question that I just kind of want to get your thoughts on. And it talks about the VIPs. We know that, say, for example, executives at a company are usually higher profile. You can find out who they are in the news, and often they're the targets of specific types of like spear phishing or so forth versus generic employees. So in your experience at Nationwide, can you tell us what you've ran into with respect to that without, of course, divulging anything confidential?
Sure. So I'm going to talk about Microsoft 365 specifically, just because that's where I've had the most amount of, as well as I've utilized Proofpoint in the past to leverage this. But so Microsoft and Proofpoint, just again, using those as examples because I've utilized them, allow you to create lists of those VIPs. And they allow you to apply, and I hate to use this because I know it's the most buzzwordy thing in the entire universe. They let you apply machine learning and to those VIPs to avoid those spear phishing scenarios. Microsoft lets you, I believe the limitation is 60 people that you can add to that extremely, monitored and analyzed list of people. And it can avoid those scenarios where you've got spear phishing, impersonation. Basically, it works against those users, those VIP users that you care about, but it also works vice versa. If somebody outside your organization attempts to impersonate one of your VIP users to one of your existing employees, it catches that type of thing as well. Proofpoint and Microsoft have poured a lot of energy and time and resources into building out those feature sets, and that's kind of where they advertise as kind of their bread and butter around those things, is to deal with those scenarios, especially with the current pandemic and everything going on. We're seeing more and more of those types of attacks come out of the woodwork.
So there's a couple more questions in here regarding bring your own key. So first of all, I want to get your perspective on bring your own key, and then I will follow up with this particular, with Charisma's question about securing these.
Yeah, so bring your own key. So bring your own key, there's definitely a ton of gotchas here, right? And it's going to be varied between different cloud environments. So for example, if you bring your own key to Microsoft 365, you actually break a lot of the collaboration functionality within Office 365 by bringing your own key. But there are regulatory scenarios where bring your own key allows you to not make sure that nobody else has access to your environment and that you own that data that's there. But it's going to vary by cloud. I think it's an additional control that if you are being extremely security conscious or trying to meet a regulatory concern, bring your own key, we're seeing be made available in more and more cloud environments. But again, your mileage is totally going to vary because some cloud providers have built it in a way that, you know, if they're dealing with different workloads within that cloud environment, some will support it across workloads, but other ones, you know, the moment that you secure, like for example, your mail environment won't be able to talk to whatever you're using for file collaboration. But then there's things like Salesforce where they support it natively and it works fairly well because they understand that it's important to their customers. And a lot of their customers rely on the type of data that they're storing in there to be protected because it is sensitive in nature. So that's generally what I've seen around that.
So I've also noticed that people have a misconception between client-side encryption and bring your own key. So that's where, you know, what I'm talking about is maybe you encrypt the data before you put it in something like Office 365 or in Dropbox because the cloud service provider has no reason to read the data in the clear. But with bring your own key, you're actually giving your key temporarily to the cloud service provider so they can do the encryption on your behalf, and then they destroy the key immediately after. And so usually what I tell people is, well, don't use bring your own key unless you really need to do it, because because then all of a sudden you're responsible for the life cycle of that key. If you destroy the key, you might have lost access to a bunch of information you put in the cloud because the cloud provider destroys it every time you're done. So question from Charisma, any suggestions for securing customer tenants when a provider does not allow bring your own key?
So I think you actually did a pretty good job of talking about that, Ken. I think that where we're seeing more and more people, instead of doing bring your own key, because it is such an impactful thing and a lot of people don't want to carry that responsibility of, again, you know, managing that life cycle of that key in their environment. What we're seeing is people use you know, DRM or other sorts of services where they encrypt the data before it goes up to the various cloud services. So it's not so much, again, and I'm not saying you shouldn't secure your tenant. You should absolutely secure whatever cloud tenant you're utilizing. But, you know, as an additional protection, you can secure the files before they go up to the tenant, or secure the data before they go up to the tenant utilizing different DRM solutions.
So have you looked at the capabilities of CASBs to provide that encryption before, you know, encryption en route to the cloud service provider?
Yeah, so I'll talk to the one specific instance that I've dealt with in the past. Is we had a requirement that data had to be encrypted before it was stored in Salesforce. So, for example, at the time, the company that I was working at, we had Netscope as our CASB, and Netscope provides the ability to utilize your own key to tokenize the data before it goes and gets stored within Salesforce, which a lot of customers actually have a pretty strict requirement on, because again, for a lot of Salesforce instances, we're talking about credit card numbers or addresses, you know, CRM type data. So I've seen in the CASB space that they either have the feature or they don't have the feature. And if they don't have the feature, they're usually backing into some sort of other DRM tooling that they have available to them. I know, for example, like Microsoft leans heavily on Microsoft Information Protection as their DRM solution. So you see that integrated across their CASB as a way to encrypt data before it gets stored in various clouds.
Yeah, so one of the problems though with encrypting the data before you put it into a system like Salesforce is you're effectively using that Salesforce for something just as storage, because they can't then use that data. So for example, if you encrypt an address before it's stored in Salesforce, are you going to print that ciphertext on an envelope that you want to do a direct to the customer?
So
people don't understand that.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I'm glad that you mentioned that because what people typically do, I probably should have answered it along these lines, is they typically will tokenize specific fields that they just across the board they just don't want it to ever be exposed within Salesforce when people are utilizing it, either to Salesforce themselves or other people utilizing whatever solution they're utilizing. So things like credit card numbers, nobody needs to, or the bulk of that credit card number before it goes up there. So that's a really good point, and I'm glad that that you brought that up.
Yeah, but then you're trusting your CASB to do the tokenization for you, right?
Yeah, again, it's on the customer to manage all of that.
Yeah,
So.
yeah. So at the end of the day, you have to trust somebody with something, right? So we got another good question in here from Anonymous. So we have Anonymous here at this conference as well. And they're asking, what strategies have you used to document multiple cloud environments for audit compliance and continuity purposes?
So that's a really tricky one. I'll be honest with you, I don't know if I'm going to be able to answer that holistically. I know that we've had probably the same challenges that you've had, that whoever's asking that question, because every cloud provider is different, and all cloud providers are not the same in terms of audit compliance and continuity. I mean, you're talking about the heavyweights, that are out there that are probably going to meet most of, what you're talking about. And they usually have compliance portals that address most of the concerns that you have. So we usually go there first to see if they have some sort of broad certification that tells you that as they introduce additional services within their cloud, if they meet the different audit compliance and continuity concerns that you have. But if you're using a smaller player, I would heavily expect to not see you meet or check all of those boxes. As well as typically you're probably going to have to dig in more and more to the smaller players to even find out if they're doing some of the things that you would just as a security practitioner expect a cloud service to be secured to be doing, out of the box. What we're finding more and more is that a lot of the CASB providers and the secure web gateway providers actually provide a service for you to look at the auditing that they've done of specific cloud providers as it relates to various compliance frameworks or auditing frameworks that you may care about. And there's also third-party solutions out there that basically give a rating to each type of cloud provider that you can use as a starting point to understand what questions you need to ask.
Well, thank you. So I can tell that the audience really enjoyed your presentation based on the comments that I'm seeing in Slack. One last question for you, and that was, since this is your first time, how did you find out about this opportunity and come to speak here today?
Sure. So I'm super active on Twitter, and I follow all the various folks that typically either co-chair a lot of these events or a lot of the SANS Twitter accounts. And I saw there was a call for a CFP, and living and breathing a lot of this stuff lately, I was like, I haven't seen a talk like around a lot of this stuff specifically. I've always seen people dive into a very specific topic. So I wanted to talk at a high level of what I think people should be looking at, kind of just being on the ground floor and living it every day and knowing that these things have been pain points throughout the different jobs that I've held. And I didn't realize that, everybody was actually very welcoming and everybody was very encouraging. And I can tell you as a first-time speaker, I very much appreciated it. The folks that are on Twitter and the folks that I've been in communication with have just been extremely supportive, and I heavily recommend that even if you're not comfortable speaking, that you should give it a shot.
Definitely. And you kind of read my mind. So during our lunch break, we'll have slides going that will talk about the the list where people can subscribe to the notices for the calls for presentations. So there's the Cloud Summit, but there's several other summits that occur as well. So Steve will be in the hallway for a while, so you can hit him up directly or you can DM him as well. And with that,